Well, we have two teenagers at home, and it's been an interesting experience. I've worked with teenagers for many years in ministry and outside of ministry, but I was always able to send them home afterwards. Now I'm the one picking them up. More than normal teenager stuff, the most interesting, or maybe the most difficult thing is that I'm remembering all of the bad stuff that I did when I was a teenager. So I'm watching my kids who are not as rambunctious as I was, different in their own way, but I'm remembering as they do something, all of these thoughts trigger in my mind of all of the stuff that I got into. And some are funny, some are frightening. I can't remember many that were dangerous, and I don't know if any were illegal. But one of the sad memories that of my teenage angst that I had forgotten about is that somehow I believed that the world was against me as a teenager. Now, that's normal for a lot of teenagers, that everything is lined up against them. I believed that people were plotting against me, and I saw boogeymen behind every corner, and they existed solely to make my life miserable. I was into some conspiracy theories back then, so it made sense in my immature mind that everything was plotting at different levels to make me miserable. The reality was no one cared enough to do that. Most of the difficulties were my own doing, and blaming others was the way to shift responsibility away from me and onto some nameless and faceless group of rapscallions and scoundrels. But even though my experience was all in my head, there are many historical examples of people who do good in the community, in the world, people who help others, people who praise the Lord, people who serve the Lord, and yet they still have people coming after them. Yet their lives are painful and full of suffering. This morning, we're going to look at Psalm 3, which was written by David during an incredibly difficult time when he was not universally loved. Because we all want to be loved. We all want to be admired. We all want to be appreciated. David did too, human being. But at this point in his life, he was not. He was living in fear. The threats at him were real. Now, this psalm is one of 14 that are linked to important events in David's life. Psalm 3 is a lament from David when his son Absalom attempted to overthrow him. Now, it would be helpful if we read the whole story of what was going on, but that covers 6 chapters in 2 Samuel, so we're not going to do that this morning. But if you're unfamiliar with this story, Absalom was every father's dream. He was talented, he was handsome, he was a man that every girl wanted and every man wanted to be. But things began to change in the family when his half-brother raped their sister, and then in response, Absalom killed him. And even through all of this turmoil, and if you really want to dig deeper, David's family line is a mess. If you want to see through this, you will see a thread that runs through it, though. David still loved his son. But Absalom wanted more than that. He didn't just want the appreciation of his father. In 2 Samuel 15, we read that Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel away from David, who was forced to flee and give up his throne and run away from Jerusalem. Now, this is a rough time for David. Keep that in mind as we read the words here that he's writing from the bottom. He's thinking that it can't get any worse than this. Now, as we read, you'll notice something else too. There's a word at the end of verses 2, 4, and 8, Selah. This is a pause, something a writer would put into songs to tell musicians to pause. Here, as we're reading, this is not to emphasize the word. This is to say, take what's read, take what's being written, and take a second. This almost dramatic pause, kind of like we do in music sometimes, this emphasis on something that's about to happen. And so take that as we read this together. I'm not going to say the word, but I'll pause as David intended. So with that in mind, let's read Psalm chapter 3 together. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. What would you do if your husband or your wife or your son or your daughter decided to fight against you? Maybe you've had that happen. Maybe it's someone close to you, someone you trusted, you invested in, only for them to turn on you. Now, while our experiences were not royalty, so our experiences probably won't match exactly what David went through, at least in terms of severity or dramatic intrigue, the truth is your pain is the same. That feeling of helplessness, that feeling of being abandoned, the feeling that there's no one else that's supporting you, no one on your side, that's the same. Grief and heartache that comes from being stabbed in the back by people who should be loyal is always painful. And you could hear the suffering in the words that David wrote. Oh Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. I've had people close to me turn on me. And even though there were only a few people, it did feel like that the world was against me. David's own son was plotting to kill him, and so David was having to constantly look over his shoulder. Absalom had gathered an army to destroy his father. All of this was overwhelming. It was so bad for David that he cries out to God. This is the first point this morning for how to deal with this kind of suffering. Tell God your problem. Now, nothing that you can tell God is going to surprise him. There is nothing that you can share with God that will shock him or come as a surprise. So why tell God anything at all? That's a question, right? It's a legitimate question. Again, I come back to my experience as a parent. Nothing is sweeter than my child coming to me and asking for something. Unless it's like cookies or candy or something. But when my sons or daughter, when they need help and they say, hey, Dad, I need your help. Can you come here? There's nothing sweeter. I know they need my help. And sometimes I'll just sit back and wait. I'll wait for them to mess something up or to get frustrated or to be confused so I can come in and help, that they can see that their dad loves them, that their dad cares for them, that their dad only wants the best for them. Nothing shocks God, nothing at all. A child asking us something means that they trust us to give it to them. So when we tell God our troubles, we're not doing it so that he can find out what's going on. We tell God our troubles because it helps us remember that God is in charge and he's far more powerful than any of our problems. We tell God our troubles as an act of worship. But like Job's comforters, the people around David were saying, God's not going to help you. God sees what you need and does nothing to make it better. Where is your God? Today, the argument would likely go something a little different, but you worship God and you still suffer, so there must not be a God. It's a hard one, isn't it? How can a good God allow bad things to happen to anyone, let alone his own people? Can I say this? There is no easy answer for this. This is a difficulty that the Christian faith we struggle with. I can answer it theologically. God allows bad things to happen so that we rely more on him and so that his glory shines brighter. I get that. But when you're in the middle of a difficult time, it's really hard to wrestle with these theological truths, isn't it? Why would David have to suffer such a difficult existence? even after he's called a man after God's own heart. We know that he sinned, did some horrible things, but he had faith. So shouldn't that ease his pain a little bit? None of us would want our children to suffer. See, this is what the health and wealth and prosperity gospel teaches. Obey God, you'll be blessed with good things. You won't get sick, you'll have money. It's a garbage system, and I know that because I've done funerals for people who love Jesus who died in their 30s or 40s. They gave their life to Jesus, and we think, how is that fair? If the prosperity gospel is legit, how in the world can someone like that pass away? They gave everything to God. Did they somehow miss something? Did they somehow not have enough faith? So I think it's obvious that those who follow Jesus are not promised an easy life. In fact, I think it's the exact opposite. So following Jesus brings pain. We see this over and over and over again through countless missionary stories. So how could God allow this to happen? Can't fully understand it sometimes, but I think it comes back certainly to God's sovereignty. If God created everything, he's more powerful than anything we could ever imagine. It also means that he knows everything, which tells us that we only see a tiny, tiny sliver of reality, of time. God sees beginning and end. Maybe a good example here would be when a doctor comes to tell you that you need major surgery, and that surgery will bring you pain. The recovery will be awful. The physical therapy will be even worse. It's easy to say, well, I just can't go through that pain. I'm just not going to do it. But the doctor recognizes that without the surgery, you may not make it through. It's the only way to make you better, even though you will suffer in the process. One writer said this. He says that a child is playing in the yard, and the yard is full of thorns and stuff that cuts. But the dad says, son, I need you to trust me. Get on the ground, do a military crawl, and come to the front porch. And the kid says, I don't understand. I don't know what's going on. The dad says, trust me. Believe me. I need you to do this. And so the kid gets on his stomach, and he's crawling, and he's cutting himself. And by the time he gets up, his shirt is shredded. And the father says, son, look. And he turns around and sees a snake hanging from the tree ready to bite. The only way to get away from the reach of that snake was to get in the ground, get dirty, get injured, get hurt in order to save the child. See, we only see a small picture. We only see what we experience. That's all we know. I have to believe that our suffering is part of God's plan somehow. He could stop it, but he often chooses not to. David wonders about this in Psalm 22. He says this, my God, again, you've heard this before, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh, my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. I often can't give a perfect reason for why we suffer, but it does point us to the fact and the reality is that God is so much bigger than our suffering and our circumstances. And hear me on this. I'm not saying that we have to like it. I don't enjoy doing funerals for my friends. I don't enjoy dealing with pain. I don't enjoy seeing friends and church members and people in my family go through difficult times. I don't enjoy that at all. But here's what we can't do. We can't, as Christians, and this is so hard, we can't let our circumstances rob our joy. You've heard this before. Joy and happiness are very different. Happiness comes and goes. It's fleeting. It won't be there in your suffering. I hope that you're not happy when you're suffering. But joy is long-lasting, it's sustaining, it's deeper, it's more fulfilling. Look at verses 3 and 4. See where David finds his joy. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. Verses 1 and 2 show that David is not happy. He's got his own son is plotting against him. Literally armies coming to get him, to pull him away from power. Nothing seems to be going right for him. He's lost so much. He still says, though, that God is everything to him. Right here, David is testifying to the sovereignty of God. Tim Keller was a pastor in New York City. He wrote dozens of books. Interesting enough, he waited until he was older to write books. He had really no platform until then, and he prolifically wrote books on almost everything in the Christian life, and guys like me in our circles are profoundly influenced by him and his ability to connect with people who are not believers, to address things of the faith in a way that was intellectually stimulating and had some substance. He was diagnosed with cancer in 2021, and when he announced it publicly, he said this: "It is endlessly comforting to have a God who is both infinitely more wise and more loving than I am. He has plenty of good reasons for everything he does and allows that I cannot know, and therein is my hope and strength." When he died last year, his last words were this, quote, "There is no downside for me leaving, not in the slightest." These words are from a man who understood God's sovereignty in the midst of suffering. It's the same thing we see from David. "In my flesh, I have no reason to be satisfied with God, but I am not God, so I can not fully understand why this is happening. But in all my suffering, I will give every ounce of energy I have to praise him all the more." In the middle of his suffering, Job said, "Though he slay me, I will hope in him." Verse 3 tells us to glory in God because there is no hope outside of that. And then in verse 4, David shows that he is confident in this. He says, "I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill." At this point, as David is writing this, there's no guarantee that his family will be restored. There's no guarantee that he'll return to the throne. For us, there's no guarantee that whatever you have will be better. It may take your life. It may take the life of someone you love. And if this life is all that there is, it's hopeless. If this existence that we have where we suffer and we live and then we die, if that's the end of the story, if there is no more left, that's hopeless. We have nothing. But if your hope is in the world to come and in the one who died for you, then suffering and death is not what defines you. It's a momentary defeat, which is all that it is, but it's not loss at all. Paul says in Philippians 1, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." This is the hope that we have, and it's the hope that David carried with him too. David cried out to God, and God answered. So what happens next? Verse 5. God promises that he will sustain us. David writes, "I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me." David doesn't say this, but when you're in the middle of a storm, emotionally, spiritually, you don't lay down and relax. When you have stress, when the bombs are dropping, again, literally or figuratively, you don't sleep. You don't rest. God's sovereignty over David's circumstances and David's trust in it is what gave him peace. The restlessness was gone, and David could relax. How? God provided that for him. But not only did God sustain David, he strengthened him. Verse 6. "I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around." Quite the change, right? Just in one chapter. And I think we all need to hear this. We want God to sustain us, to support us, but we want the strength to stand too. It could mean physically, but here I think David just simply needs courage. He needs God to give him something supernaturally so that he could go forward, he could move ahead. This is hard. I can speak from my own existence. Easy is what I want. Yes, I want deliverance or rescue or freedom from something, but I really don't want to be inconvenienced along the way. Wins are fun, losses aren't. So I want to win. I want to be happy. I want to enjoy things, but it's in the losses, in the suffering, and in the pain where we showcase our true feelings and what we truly value. In the worst moments of my ministry, I often lost sight of everything I'm saying to you today. My life at times has been dominated, controlled by my circumstances. I felt a lot like David. This is speaking to me in a lot of ways, reminding me of those moments when I took my eyes off and I failed more times than I can count. At times it felt like everyone was standing against me. A few were. I've had a few, again, don't read into this, not here. A few had plotted against me, some nasty stuff. And it was in those difficult moments that I showed what I valued. And unfortunately, I sometimes responded to anger with anger. I began to ignore people because it was easier to do that. I failed to see God's hand in all of that. No, God didn't approve of what was going on, but He allowed it. See, when I was fearing for my future, God still had a plan. And at the most simple level, the plan was for us, my family, to be here with your family. See, in the middle of the difficulties, I said the same questions. How many are my foes, God? Everyone is plotting against me. God, where are you? I'm literally preaching your word. I'm trying and I'm working and I'm doing what I can, failures and all, and yet still this. Can I tell you, I would not be here as a member first of Grace Chapel if that hadn't happened. The friendships that we've built would not have happened. These relationships that will last for a very, very long time, I hope, would not have happened if I had not gone through that. I needed to learn some things that only failure and tragedy could bring. I needed to be brought to the bottom of my, whatever I viewed as my, who I am, my identity, so that I could only look up. I needed a reminder that I am not in control. And this is what David was reminded of as well in verses 7 and 8. He says, God will save me. He says, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. I read this and my mind goes a few different ways. Again, things that I need to be reminded of myself. First, salvation belongs to God. I don't help Him along the way, and I don't do anything to earn it. It's a gift that He freely gave to me, and if I can't earn it, I can't unearn it. It's important. Second, one day God will defeat all of His enemies. David's hope was that God will save him by striking down his enemies. Every one of those people will stand before God and receive what is due. For most of David's enemies, that meant that God would strike them down in His wrath. Not pleasant, but it did give David the joy that justice would one day be served. Third, and this is building on the second and equally as important, there is hope for those who stand against God. I know this personally because I was an enemy of God. I stood against Him. I decided that I was the God of my life, that my desires needed worshiping more than anything else. It's the story of all of us. Personally, through the difficulties that I've gone through in ministry, that I've experienced, that kind of just a whirlwind of stuff, that's why I can't hate people. Even the ones that made things extremely difficult. They are believers who fell into the trap of making non-essential things more important than they should have been. They let their preferences dominate. They gave into gossip and power struggles. Just like you and me, they gave power to their sin and let it fester. But they are still people that Jesus purchased. People who were unlovable and yet God loved them. And since salvation belongs to the Lord, my job is to pray for them, love them, because they are my brothers and sisters, regardless of what they brought. Their family. This is the hope of the gospel. That even those who stand against God can still be, faults and all, can still be brought into the family, can still be welcomed, can still be forgiven. But it is easy, isn't it, to appreciate God's sovereignty when things are going well. Yeah, we're in a car, and a car just nicks us when if we were there a half second too late, we would have been T-boned. It's good to appreciate God's sovereignty then, right? Well, God was looking out for me. But what about when you do get hit? What about when the car doesn't miss you? What about when the diagnosis is not good? What about when emotionally you are at an end and you can't handle it anymore? What about when you can't get out of bed? When everything is upside down, we begin to wonder, don't we? We need a miracle, so why can't God just give it to me? Doesn't God see this? Doesn't God care about me? So why isn't He protecting me? Why isn't He giving me what I need? I want to close this morning with, I did it a couple weeks ago with a song from a band. This time it's actually going to be from a rap duo. Hear me on this. There is a Christian rap group in Portland, Oregon, named Beautiful Eulogy. You don't have to like hip-hop to understand this. The reason why I'm sharing this is because as I was preparing this sermon, I started thinking about how my last sermon, the last sermon I would give at another church, how I preached. And I looked back at the last words that I spoke to a church, and it was unexpected. Didn't know this was going to be the end. At least not when I preached it. And I closed with this. The song lyrics go out. I'm not going to rap it for you. If in one unfortunate moment you took everything that I own, everything you've given from heaven above, and everything that I've ever known, if you stripped away my ministry, my influence, my reputation, my health, my happiness, my friends, my pride, my expectation, if you cause for me to suffer or to suffer for the cause of the cross, if the cost of my allegiance is prison and all my freedoms are lost, if you take the breath from my lungs and you make an end of my life, if you take the most precious part of me and you take my kids and my wife, it would crush me, it would break me, it would suffocate and cause heartache. I would taste the bitter, dark providence, but you would still preserve my faith. What's concealed in the heart of having is revealed in the losing of things, and I can't even begin to imagine the sting that kind of pain brings. I would never blame you for evil, even if you caused me pain. I came into this world with nothing, and when I die, it will be the same. I will praise your name in the giving and taking away. If I have you, I can lose everything and still consider it gain. Church, putting ourselves in the perspective of David, what happens if everything we have withers away? What happens if the people you love abandon you? What happens if you lose all your money? What happens if your health fails? Is that the end of your story? Or will you taste the bitter, dark providence of God and lean on Him even more? God has given you all that you have, and He has every right to take it away. But what we're left with at that moment shows what we value. If our value is in Christ, all of it could be taken, and we still have all that we need. The world could be coming against us, just like it was for David, and we'd still have joy in being a child of God. For a season, I lost something that I valued. I had the title of former pastor. And I wasn't sure if I even wanted to try it again. Honestly, I wanted something else, anything else. I wanted to run away as far as I could. Still go to church, still be a member, but let someone else deal with stuff. Right? I was stuck in Psalm 3, 1 and 2. I said to God, "Oh Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me." I can't tell you how many times that I did ask that, maybe not vocally, but in my heart, "God, where are you in this?" I tried and I failed, but I gave what I thought was my best effort, and still this happens. My short-sightedness caused me to forget that God had a plan, even in the loss and in the pain. The plan was to sharpen me and bring me to a place where I can forgive. It was to shape me to be a better pastor, to rely on Jesus more than I ever had before. It's also to bring us here, to be with you. See, I couldn't see some things. But even though I couldn't see the whole story, praise God that I didn't lose trust in Him. If I had lost that, I would have moved on to something else, anything else, and I would have missed this. I want you to not be like me. Can I tell you that? Don't be like me. Cling to the sovereign goodness of God, especially when what you want to do is anything but that. Remember, you can't see the future. You can't see the entire story. You may have enemies all around. You may have thousands coming after you. But God's promise to you is that you are secure in Him. No matter what your situation is, if you are a child of God, you are loved and protected. You may suffer and you may lose every battle here, but as David says in verse 8, salvation belongs to the Lord. His blessing be on His people. Church, the truth is, you have the greatest blessing. Your blessing is Jesus and what He's done for you and what He promises to do for you. Your blessing is an eternal life free from the bad stuff that is swallowing you up right now. Let this be our joy. Let this be our prayer. Would you pray with me?